Good morning, everybody. My name is John Lighthart. I am a Spring 2020 Marquette Intern coach. And before I begin, I'd like to thank the Marquette Strength and Conditioning staff for letting me work with them this semester, as well as present today. And without further ado, I will present my sport, which is Spikeball, also known as round net. All right, and so for those who have never seen the sport or do not know what it is, here's a brief video montage of the sport being played. This is a semifinal match in a tournament.
Top match of the 10, he goes to the Rookies versus Strange Embrace. Let's take a look at this absolutely epic quarterfinal match. Most games end at 21. That's when this one just got started. What a match it was. 46-44 Strange Embrace winning this marathon match and moving on to the semifinals. Top match.
Alrighty, now just to give a brief history about the sport. It was originally introduced in 1989 in Japan. However, it gained a lot of traction back in 2015 when current CEO Chris Reuter introduced the sport to a show called Shark Tank. And since then, it has gained a lot of traction on social media to where it now has over 4 million players worldwide. Now, just to give a little bit of an introduction to how the sport is played with some of the rules and the setup, here is a brief video tutorial.
The sport of round net is played 2-on-2 with each team starting on opposite sides of the net. Once the ball is served, you get up to 3 touches to try to return the ball back on the net, just like 2-on-2 volleyball. Think bump, set, and spike. What makes round net unique is that after the serve, there are no sides or boundaries. You can run, pass, and spike the ball off the net in any direction to try to win the point. When a team fails to return the ball, the rally is over and the other team receives 1 point. That's about it for the basics.
All right, so with that being stated, some of the things that are usually incorporated that weren't included in the video is that during a tournament or match, the distance limit for the server is usually going to be at least 6 feet. However, the receivers can be as close or as far away from the net as possible. In the game, it's going to be rally scoring, so it can go from 11 to 15. Most commonly, going up to 21 is used, and the team that has to win needs to score 2 more points. In some cases, though, we will see that be different, as in the first video, where we saw them go up to roughly 45 points. In tournaments, usually it's going to be played on surfaces like grass and turf. However, it can be played on sand as well. Now, when looking into the structure of a tournament, it's going to be structured with double elimination as well as a seeded bracket in order to bring things close to the final and yet in an orderly fashion. When coming to qualifying for national teams like Team USA, you need to become one of the top 5 qualifiers from one of the 4 tournaments that happens around the globe. All right, now getting into the sport itself, some of the main movements as seen in the videos are going to be spiking as well as setting. There's going to be a lot of sprinting involved with cutting and shuffling. This will be done in order to maneuver around other players as well as around the net itself. And some of the more unorthodox moves that you will see are things like diving or even sometimes a slide tackle to use your feet to return the ball as well. Now with those movements, some of the main injuries that we will see are going to be ankle sprains as well as knee injuries like ligament damage, ACL tears. Quadricep tendonitis is fairly common due to the constant breaking down, cutting, and jumping. But we will also see quite a bit of shoulder overuse since the primary mechanism for scoring is high velocity spiking itself. With the movements being stated for the sport, some of the qualities of focus for a training program would be strength, power. Those movements are going to build a foundation in order to be able to apply enough force in the ground, allowing for more explosive movements, which will then lead into the speed as well as anaerobic endurance and agility of the athlete. These will help with maneuverability as well as playing as efficiently and quick as possible. When trying to fuel each of these abilities, the main energy systems of focus are going to be the glycolytic system and the phosphocreatine system. Since the sport is very fast-paced, not many breaks involved, and of course involves explosive movements, these are going to be the primary energy systems used. Some of the testing equipment that I would be using when implementing a program for these athletes is going to be the WIDI program, or the WIDI system. I would be using this for tracking sprint speeds, as well as the Pro Agility 5-10-5 tests and some variations of it. I would also be using Elite Form to track barbell speeds as well as force production. And I would also be using Just Jump in order to track the heights for things like vertical jump as well as counter movement jumps. Now, here's a brief overview of my annual plan. As you can see, I have it separated into 3 main seasons. There's the off season in the green, preseason in the orange, and over with the multicolor variation is the in season. So how I broke it down was each season is broken down into 4-week mesocycles. Each one varies depending on the length of it. Going into the phases of the plan, I have the off season broken down into a general preparatory phase focusing on core movements as well as developing strength and some power. In the preseason, I have a sport specific phase, in which case I'll be priming the athlete to use more power as well as explosiveness during speed and agility. Moving into the in season, I have more of a focus on competition preparatory phase, so making sure the athletes are rested well enough for the competitions they're going into, as well as keeping that intensity high enough and that load high enough. Now, as you may notice, in the middle of the in season, I have a GPP2 and an SPP2. This would be for me to touch back on some of the traits that we had focused on in the past, just make sure that the athletes are keeping up on those and kind of seeing where they're at after the competitions. But before going into a big competition, which is the World Championship, I'm going to want to see if my athletes are ready for that, transition back into competition prep phase, making sure the load's a little bit lower and making sure that they're ready. Some of the main sporting events during this plan are going to be, of course, preliminary games before the World Qualifiers. World Qualifiers, which is a tournament located at 4 different locations, in which case we will be traveling, I believe, to Cleveland, Ohio for that, so not too long of a distance. We will have games every 2 weeks in between the World Qualifiers and World Championship. And then the World Championship is going to be for 3 days in the end of September in Belgium. And just a final note, some of the things I have on the bottom are school stressors, things like midterms, finals, as well as breaks. So diving a little bit into the specifics, here's my off season. This is going to be about 21 weeks long. Strategy for this is going to be to build a mainly volume as well as a solid strength base. The structure for this is going to be off of a 4-day per week plan. Monday, Tuesday, break in the middle, Thursday, Friday with an upper-lower split. Primarily, the testing that I'll be using is going to be 3-rep maxes with a lot of the core lifts. I'll be checking the progress on each of those once per mesocycle during the off season. And once I go into the in season for the GPP2 phase, I'll be checking twice a week just to make sure that they're staying in line with progress as to where I want them to be. What the density and intensity will look like during this is going to be mainly 4 sets of 4 to 8 reps at 75 to 85% 1-rep max. However, I may increase that as it gets closer to the end of the off season in order to amp up that intensity just a little bit more, as well as the volume to prime them for the preseason. A lot of the exercises I'll be using are common ones like bench press, front squat, RDL shrugs, rows, as well as unilateral variations of each. The main goals that I have for this season are going to be laying the groundwork for more specific training in the later phases, building up a lot of force production capabilities, as well as increasing their lean muscle mass via hypertrophy. Going into the preseason, this is going to be shorter, being about 9 weeks long. Goals I have for this are going to be to prep for the season, of course, as well as developing power, speed, and agility, relating a little bit more to the sport. I will be shortening down the structure during the week since the practices will be getting a little bit longer and having them more often. I'll be going to a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'll be having this with a intensity variation, in which case I'll have a light day, medium day, heavy day. That way it can give you some leeway in order to adjust to the student schedules if they have a stressful weekend beforehand or if they just got back from a game. The intensity and volume for this is going to look a little bit smaller than it was in the off season. I'm going to be decreasing the reps. However, I'll be keeping the intensity around 70–75%, but this time we'll be focusing on max speed during these lifts in order to focus on explosiveness as well as those quick movements due to translating better in the sport. A lot of the exercises I'll be using are things like barbell squat jumps, push presses, loaded work with the Raptors for sprint agility, so shuffles and sprints. I'll also be incorporating some core rotation, anti-rotation, things like the Palloff press. And importantly, I'll be incorporating some repeated sprint ability in order to work on that anaerobic endurance. Since the athletes won't be sprinting too far, I'll keep it to about 10 to 20 meters in length. The testing for this phase is going to be at the beginning and end of each mesocycle, tracking them more closely, making sure they are where I want them to be. I'll be testing things like vertical jump, counter movement jump, the core movements still for speed and power, as well as sprints and pro agility. And diving into the in season, this is going to be a 24-week phase, so quite a bit longer, in which case the goals for this are going to be to maintain a lot of the traits that I developed in the past, reducing the injury risk, of course, since I want them to be in it for the long run, in which case the weekly structure is going to be remain the same with a Monday, Wednesday, Friday look for it, as well as intensity variation, giving me some leeway to structure it. Intensity and volume is going to be around 3 sets, 3 to 5 reps, so decreasing that volume a little bit. I will be varying the intensity as well, percent 1RM, just to accommodate for where the athletes are at. And during the general and specific phase that are incorporated in the middle of the in-season, I will be reevaluating as well as redeveloping a lot of those traits mid-season, kind of touching back on the main strength power movements. Now, a focus for this phase is going to be rehabilitation mainly, getting them ready for the end of the season as well as recovering from the beginning. So things like mobility, sleep, nutrition, rehydration, as well as stress reduction are going to be huge in keeping these athletes here for the long run, as well as keeping them performing at their best. All right. Now, before I finish up my presentation, I found this video was released by the Spikeball Net Association. Kind of shows how athletes are keeping sport specific with their applications, but not necessarily playing the sport itself.
Hey, can you give me a seltzer?
All right, and I wouldn't recommend cooking with that, but if you guys have any questions for me, for those online, you can reach me on my social media handle on Twitter. There's my email as well as on my cell phone. And if you guys have any questions for me on the Zoom call right now, I'm open to accepting those.
John, I've got a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So at the beginning, you mentioned that you would use elite form as part of your tracking, but I don't think you mentioned throughout your presentation how you would utilize it. Just curious if you had any specific phases or weeks picked out where you would be utilizing VBT.
Right, so a lot of that I would use during my off season and the preseason when I'm going to be doing the power movements such as barbell squat jumps, or for a bench press or a squat. When I'm going to be working on the velocity based, I'll be tracking the barbell speeds, having them hit a certain velocity, or depending on the weight that they're using, I'll want them to hit a certain amount of force produced.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
Yeah. One thing I did want to note, and it was something that I actually covered with, I believe it was Emily when I was talking to her, was that since some of the games are actually played on sand, she was wondering how I might be able to transfer the training into that as well. And I did a little bit of digging and found that a lot of the research has shown that the eccentric forces are decreased a little bit during the play. However, what's drastically increased is going to be metabolic stress. So if my athletes were to be playing in more of a sand setting, one thing that I would definitely want to emphasize more would be the anaerobic conditioning portion. So things like repeated sprint ability, or just continuously having them go during a agility reaction test or something like that. But as far as the training would go, I might incorporate more of a, I'd say, quick explosive movement in order to get out of those sand pits, or reacting a little bit quicker, since reaction time does decrease a little bit with that.
John, good presentation.
Thank you.
While you were like designing your annual plan for this, were there any points in time, like whether it was conversations you had with myself, Emily, Dan, whoever, or just in your thought process in general, were there any points in time where you like almost did a U-turn on your thinking, like this is what I'd planned to do, and then because of something that you had learned or questions that had been asked to you, like, oh, maybe that's not the right track? Were there any points in time like that?
I would definitely say that once I started to get towards preseason and in-season, the schedule just started to get a little bit more, I'd say, complicating, and having more things come up that would interfere with it, such as tests during the week for students, or even just the traveling, especially the distance of time between the qualifiers itself and the World Championship. I had to rethink how I wanted to restructure my in-season, and I thought about then, of course, the reintroduction of some of those other phases with keeping up with some of the other traits. So definitely a U-turn there. And I would definitely say with some of the testing that I would be using as well. Change of direction, I had a little bit more focus on with like the Pro Agility 5-10-5. However, once I started digging a little bit deeper into how agility is actually performed and how it's actually developed throughout an in-season or off-season, with reaction tests and even just games, I started thinking about some ways that I can incorporate it into after a workout, make things kind of just fun with the game, or having it during a session as well.
Gotcha. Good. Very good.